Hi, the SI meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Tuesday, May 10th. We're rapidly approaching hurricane season. It officially begins on June 1st. We'll take a look now at what I expect over the summer in the tropical Atlantic and take a look back at what we had last summer. Normal tropical season in the Atlantic produces around 11 named tropical systems, 2 or 3 of which usually affect the United States. Last summer, the U.S. was spared almost completely, only hit a couple of glancing blows along the outer banks of North Carolina, for example, as most of the tropical systems that did develop in a well above normal season veered off to the north and east before ever reaching the U.S. East Coast. I think this summer the U.S. will get impacted by some tropical systems, and we will have another active season. So let's take a look at some of the reasons why now. First of all, this is the sea surface temperature anomaly chart from a year ago, early last May, and a couple things to point out. First of all, here we have the western African coast, and all of these yellows and oranges represented well above normal temperatures last summer. This is again about a year ago, right in the breeding grounds of the tropical Atlantic. Well above normal, increased the chances last summer for an active season. In fact, we did have an active season. A couple other things to point out here, however. At this time last year, early May last year, it was actually colder than normal in the Gulf of Mexico. That kind of played a role as the latter part of the tropical season, when the Gulf of Mexico really becomes more important, wasn't quite as active as it could have been. But we'll just want to take a note and see how things have changed for this year. Of course, out in the Pacific last summer, things were a little bit different as well as we approached summer tropical season. In the Pacific, there was a weakening El Nino represented here in the equatorial region with yellows and oranges above normal temperatures, which is of course an El Nino pattern, and this particular signal was weakening last spring into early summer. In other words, the El Nino was becoming more or less of a neutral signal by the time the summer rolled around. Similar things are happening this summer in the sense that we are approaching neutrality in the tropical Pacific. And the Pacific does have an impact on what happens in the Atlantic, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Here's just another way to look at El Nino or La Nina, what's going on in the Pacific. It's from a NOAA website that has the indexes. Basically what we see here is negative values here like we had at the end of 2010 and into the this current time period of 2011. Negative numbers here represent La Nina, when the sea surface temperatures are below normal out in the central Pacific, and the red shading here represents above normal temperatures, or El Nino conditions, which we had earlier last year into the beginning of the summer of 2010. Now this time about a year ago, again, we had a plus 0.8, in other words, a El Nino condition, but it was weakening to the point where it became neutral, or even a La Nina condition by the middle part of the summer. Similarly, in some fashion this summer, we have a La Nina condition. However, this will weaken as well into neutral condition, I expect, by the middle part of the summer. So last year we had El Nino, this year we have La Nina. Both, however, are weakening as spring becomes summer, and last year we had an active season, and I believe this year we'll have an active season as well. Now here's the current sea surface temperature anomaly chart across most of the globe, and this of course is playing an important role in what I expect for the summer in terms of the Atlantic tropical season. Well, once again, let's focus in on the western African coast, because here is the breeding ground for tropical systems. Low pressure waves come off of the Saharan desert region of Africa and move westward with the trade winds across the tropical Atlantic, and oftentimes head towards the U.S. East Coast, or sometimes veer into the Caribbean Sea and then up towards the Gulf of Mexico. But notice this entire region from the western African coast all the way to throughout the Gulf of Mexico is basically above normal. We see lots of yellows and oranges here. There's a little bit of an area of colder than normal. For the most part, we're above normal temperature-wise, sea surface temperature-wise, from the African coast all the way to the Texas Gulf Coast. This is the main reason, the main factor I believe will lead to an active season. In other words, perhaps more than 11 named tropical systems. Again, this is the breeding ground for the tropical systems in the Atlantic region that affect the U.S., and the fact that the Gulf of Mexico this year is warmer than normal compared to last year at this time when it was colder than normal may play an important role in the U.S. getting impacted by some of these storms. This increases the chances that there will be some systems spilling over into the Gulf and surviving, and even some homegrown type tropical systems in the second half of the summer in the Gulf of Mexico. So again, I believe because of this temperature pattern, not only will we have an active tropical season, but we are much more likely to get impacted by some of these tropical systems in the U.S., both from the Gulf Coast and up and down the East Coast. Florida and North Carolina are the top two states for getting impacted by tropical systems. However, there are some similarities to this particular pattern to decades ago, perhaps in the 50s, when even the upper part of the East Coast got affected by some hurricanes. So basically, the entire East Coast has to stay on guard. Meanwhile, let's take a look at the Pacific. What's happening out here, there's kind of a horseshoe region of colder than normal temperatures as we still have a La Nina pattern, even though it is starting to weaken a little bit. I expect it'll weaken some more as we approach the summer months. In fact, it should become rather neutral by the time the midsummer season rolls around. So neutral conditions in the Pacific are actually a positive factor for the development of tropical systems in the Atlantic, because curiously enough, El Nino conditions in the Pacific actually inhibit tropical storm growth in the Atlantic. It somehow has an impact on upper air winds, which tend to inhibit the development of tropical systems. This year, with no El Nino signal in the Pacific, in fact, there is a positive factor coming from the Pacific that can lead to, or can certainly accompany an active season in the tropical Atlantic. So as far as the Mid-Atlantic region goes, there's really no true strong signal indicating one way or another what should happen in the Mid-Atlantic region. I believe we'll probably continue the pattern of above normal precipitation, at least slightly above normal precipitation. There's some colder air spilling into the southern part of Canada, and that should continue for a while, which increases the activity across the northern part of the U.S. We've had an above normal precip pattern in the spring, and I expect that should continue into the summer months. As far as temperatures go, we are probably headed for a normal to slightly above normal in terms of temperature over the summer in the Mid-Atlantic region. Certainly the soil conditions are rather moist right now, which helps to reduce the threat of severe heat, and we ought to get some rainfall at least in the second half of the tropical season from the remains of tropical systems that move overland from the Gulf of Mexico or off the southeast coast. So that's about it for now. We'll, of course, take a look at this later on in the summer, but for now it looks like we are headed for an active tropical season, and the U.S. should get impacted by some of these storms as opposed to what happened last summer. And the entire East Coast should be on guard for a potential tropical system this year. As far as the Mid-Atlantic region, nothing outrageous in terms of heat or humidity, but it looks like perhaps normal to slightly above normal temperatures and normal to slightly above normal in terms of rainfall. That's it for now. I'm the SI meteorologist, Paul Dorian.